One of the lessons of COVID-19 surely must be that none of us can really predict what's around the corner. Of course, epidemiologists and the like have long predicted that one day we would face another deadly pandemic like those in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But despite our advancements in technology and mathematical modelling, this pandemic of COVID-19 has taken most of us by surprise. But as we face the road of uncertainty and many of us have to self-isolate from this dreaded virus, we can still take the opportunity to reflect together on the big picture of life and particularly consider how our current situation bears some striking similarities to the core message of the Christian faith, the gospel. The gospel is the central message of the Bible, and there are some remarkable parallels between the gospel and the situation we find ourselves in with this pandemic. This shouldn't surprise many of us who are well versed in the Bible. Jesus and the early Christians used medical analogies to illustrate the things of the kingdom of God and the gospel all the time. Jesus, for example, healed the blind and the deaf, not only to help them, but to illustrate that we're all spiritually blind to the truth and deaf to the voice of God, and that he had come to open blind eyes and open deaf ears. The Apostle Paul said that we're all spiritually dead, and Christ had come to make us alive or born again. In the 17th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, we read of another medical story. This is the story of Jesus healing 10 lepers while he was on his way to Jerusalem. And like other medical stories, this illustrates for us great truths of the gospel. But we may be able to read this with new eyes, given our situation with this pandemic. There's some real striking connections we can make between our situation and this story.
Now on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus travelled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, "When are all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except for this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well."
Well, here are 5 ways this story connects with our situation in the middle of a pandemic and illustrates the message of Christianity, the gospel. Number 1, we all have an illness. We all have a disease. We all have a virus we call sin. We are therefore like the lepers in the story. They represent you and me, and their leprous condition represents the sin that we've all been infected with. Sin has been defined as putting yourself where God ought to be. It's when we ignore God, we take things into our own hands, we rule over our lives in our way and not his way. And we all do that. In fact, we all do that daily. Actually, technically, the word pandemic means all people. It comes from 2 ancient Greek words, pan and demos. Pan means all and makes its way into words like panorama, like in panoramic photography, or pantheon, the Roman temple that was dedicated to all the gods. Demos means people and makes its way into words like democracy and demographic. Sin, therefore, is the ultimate, truly global pandemic, the virus that we all have. But sin is not only global, it's also fatal. The symptoms of leprosy are malformations of the skin, loss of feeling, particularly in the extremities, eye problems, and it can sometimes result in death. The symptoms of coronavirus are a high temperature, continuous cough, and it can sometimes result in death. The symptoms of sin are jealousy, hate, greed, moral confusion, bitterness, cruelty, self-centeredness, crime, racism, sexism, terrorism, war, materialism, and so on and so on. And it always relates in death. Hence, sin is not only truly global, it's also 100% fatal, and we all have it. The second way this story connects to our situation and illustrates the gospel is that we've all been isolated. Luke tells us that the lepers here stood at a distance. That is because, generally speaking, all lepers of the ancient world, and even in parts of the modern world, had to socially distance themselves or self-isolate. They weren't permitted to be part of normal society. They didn't live with healthy people. They didn't participate in their communities in any way. They were social outcasts, banished from the marketplaces, and they were strictly forbidden to enter a synagogue or the temple. So they had to keep their distance from everyone. And by law, as they moved along anywhere, they had to yell out from the top of their voice, "Unclean, unclean," so that people could give them a wide berth and move away. So they self-isolated in their homes if they were lucky enough to keep them, but that would have been very, very rare. Most lepers in Jesus' day self-isolated in caves, abandoned tombs, grave sites and the like. COVID-19 has given us all a glimpse of what the lepers went through. However, we can isolate in our homes, in the surrounding comforts that each of us have. Lepers weren't so fortunate. But actually, the story and our own situation with coronavirus ought to push us to a theological point. As we all have the virus of sin, we've all been isolated from God, and He from us. We've socially and spiritually distanced ourselves from Him, but perhaps more correctly, He has distanced Himself from us. That is because as a holy, pure, good, clean God, He cannot commune with anyone who has the unclean virus of sin. So, in essence, we've all been quarantined from Him. The bottom line is God and humanity are separated. The great curtain in Israel's temple reminded the Israelites, the Jews of Jesus' day, of that great social, spiritual distance between God and humankind. Like the lepers, we've all been isolated from God. Thirdly, we all can be cured. That is great news. As I'm recording this talk, the world is still searching for a vaccine for COVID-19. Scientists across the globe are researching and looking for a cure. But thankfully, we don't have to look for a cure for the virus of sin. It's available. It's available to every single one of us, and it is totally free. It's worth noting that in Jesus' day, lepers were on the lowest rung of society. They were the true outcasts, the ones that people looked lowly on more than any other people. So in Jesus' day, they were the true marginalised ones. Yet do note that Jesus shows no hesitation whatsoever in healing them. He responds to their mercy with no inhibitions whatsoever. And He heals all 10 of them. That is great news. And the lesson for us is that Jesus has come to clean all of us. No matter who we are, no matter what we've done, no matter how sinful or unclean you feel, you've been or you are at the moment. Jesus has come to cure us, to cleanse us, all of us, every single one of us. But we may ask at this point, how do we become clean, and why is Jesus the one who can do it? Well, the lepers model for us how one becomes clean. It's by simply crying out for mercy. They don't refer to their moral performance, of how good they've been in the past or present. They don't complain that they have had a rough life and they deserve to be healed. They cry out for mercy. That's it. The original word for mercy here can be translated as compassion or pity. And this brings us to a core element of the Christian faith. That is, God is a merciful, compassionate God who takes pity on all of us. So even though we've all walked away from him, ignored him, had a referendum in our hearts, if you like, and voted to leave God, and we're now unclean, infected with the virus of sin, he still loves us. He still has mercy on us. The leper appealed to God's mercy through Christ, and he delivers on it without discrimination or hesitation. Hence, again, the most unclean of sinners can call out to Christ, and he will answer. His mercy is that wide and that deep. But how is it that Jesus makes us pure? How does he cleanse us? Is there anything in the story that gives us an indication of how it all works? Well, there's a clue, and it's found at the start of the story. Luke deliberately tells us that this miracle happened while Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. And we know from earlier chapters that Jesus was going there to die. Luke, as a narrator, tells us, and Jesus himself tells it to the disciples. He knew he was going to be betrayed, handed over, and be executed in Jerusalem. Yet he's going there all the same. He knew this was God's plan, and he was the willing servant, willing to do what God had instructed him to do all along. In order to cure us of the virus of sin, Jesus came to take it upon himself. He would take on the virus and all its consequences and absorb in his own body the death that we were all going to get. Put graphically, it was like Jesus was doing a great blood transfusion. He was swapping his clean blood for our unclean blood, and it would cost him his life. So bringing this home to us today in our situation with this pandemic, and as we hopefully see a vaccine for COVID-19 in the near future, all of this ought to remind us of the wonderful vaccine that God has provided through Christ's death. And every single one of us is invited to take it. Every single one of us can be cured completely. Fourthly, we're all invited to a better world. Jesus was going to Jerusalem to lay down his life and die, to enable us to be transformed, and not just give us a new lease in life, but to give us a full, glorious life, an eternal life beyond the grave. The lepers were instructed by Jesus to go and show themselves to the priests. Why did Jesus do that? Well, the priests of those days acted as medical police, doormen at the synagogues and the temple. They would inspect the skin of the sick and the infirmed and the leprous to make sure they were clean to enter into places of worship. By telling the lepers to go and show themselves to the priest, Jesus was doing something extremely significant. This would not only authenticate their healing, but it would officially allow them to participate in society. It would enable them to worship God with others, uninhibited by social distancing. They could walk freely in the marketplace. They could eat with their friends and their family. They could play sport. They could go fishing. They could socialise again. Put simply, as a result of being cleansed by Jesus, their world would have been radically changed, not just their bodies, but everything about their lives would have been so much better. Jesus came to give us life and life to the fullest, and ultimately bring us to a far better world. And like leprosy, COVID-19 has brought destruction, fear, anxiety, instability, financial ruin, illness, and sadly death to our world. But we will climb out of this. We will come out the other side into hopefully a better, brighter, hopefully safer world. But I wonder if this would get us all to think of the world to come because of Christ. A world that will be so beautiful and wonderful, pain-free, disease-free, where there's no more leprosy, no more COVID-19, no more cancer. It'll be amazing. A world full of love and happiness and joy and uninhibited access to God. It'll be incredible. A world of peace and harmony and togetherness, where we're free from all the bad things in life. It'll be amazing. I wonder if we can reflect on that as we come out the other side of this pandemic. And then, last of all, as this story connects with our situation with coronavirus, it has one last lesson about the gospel for us. In fact, how we should respond to the gospel. If we truly, really are infected with a disease, a virus called sin, and it's brought destruction, heartache, death to us all. And if we really have been isolated from God, socially distanced from Him, and if it is really true that He has mercy on us and loves us and has done something about it by sending Christ as our vaccine to make us clean and pure again by Him dying for us in our place, swapping places with us and giving us a new life and eventually a new world where there will be no more pain and suffering and disease and viruses and no more death, and we will live in harmony with God, uninhibited by anything, no barriers. If that's all true, then we are to live a life of gratitude. It's quite striking that only one leper comes back and thanks Jesus for what He's done. He alone finds Jesus, calls out in a loud voice, just as he and his mates might have done prior to their healing. But this time it's not cries of mercy, cries of desperation, but cries of thanks, cries of joy. And in total appreciation, he falls at the feet of Jesus to show his gratitude. Paradoxically, it was a despised Samaritan, we're told, just to sharpen the point among Jesus' predominantly Jewish audience and Jewish disciples. This sole leper who was on the bottom rung of society, not only for his leprosy but for his ethnicity, is now held up as a model to us all on how we are to respond to the gospel. It's a life of gratitude. The Christian who has been cleansed of their sin and will one day live in paradise with God ought to live a life of thankfulness, a life of inner joy and gratitude. Now, I know that might seem like a strange thing to do in a time of a global pandemic, when many of us are facing financial insecurities, perhaps job losses. Some of us are struggling with our children to homeschool them on top of a workload as we try and work online. Others are fearing for their health in one way or another. Perhaps even a few of us know someone who has perished because of coronavirus. So when we say a Christian should live a life of joy and thankfulness, one of gratitude, that's not saying we ignore the sadness, the horror of what's happening in the world. We should rightly be sad, moved, affected, even angry about what's going on in the world. And not just with COVID-19, but with a whole lot of other things that are happening in our world. But this is more a case of perspective. In the midst of it, in the eye of the hurricane, the Christian ought to find great peace, joy, hope, and thanks to God that there really is a cure for the ultimate virus, and that one day we will live uninhibited, free from viruses, diseases, pain, and even death, forever and ever. So as the Christian meanders down the road of life, and that road becomes difficult, as it is now, and we don't know what's around the next bend, or even over the next hill, we can still find tremendous reasons to be grateful, thankful to God, because one day this road will lead to a beautiful place. And we will not have to suffer sin anymore. No more social distancing from God. And we will be with Him forever and ever, pandemic free. That's a great reason to be thankful to God. So I hope that has brought you some encouragement in these very strange and difficult times, and that you see something of the connection between our current situation and the gospel and who Jesus is, what He's all about, what He came to do. To all our Boathouse family here in London, God bless to you. I hope you're staying well and safe. And that goes for all our Boathouse crew worldwide. Big love to you. Wherever you are in the world at the moment, stay safe. And God bless from us at the Boathouse Church, London.